Welcome to the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from the unapologetic perspective of the Hoosier left. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm recording from Bloomington. So, in the wake of this month's devastating election loss for Democrats in Indiana and at the federal level, we've seen a whole lot of finger-pointing and a whole lot less self-reflection from prominent Democratic pundits, consultants, and elected officials. I talked a little bit about this last week. Biden loyalists think they could have dragged their guy to one more win like Weekend at Bernie's takes Washington. Nancy Pelosi's people think Joe hung on too long. The K-Hive thinks they were dealt a bad hand. Clinton and Obama machine cogs all have their own take. Of course, few take responsibility for their part in driving us to the precipice. Some folks, who I happen to agree with, like Senator Bernie Sanders, argue that Democrats have failed to stand up for the working class by adopting neoliberal economic policies. Mainstream liberals like Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy are beginning to see this, and even stereotypical elitist conservative pundit David Brooks is writing populist class analysis in the New York Times. Some, in the professional centrist class, blame the party for going too woke. MSNBC's Morning Joe spent a whole week throwing trans folks under the proverbial bus and backing over them repeatedly. New York Congressman Tom Suozzi whined, "The Democrats have to stop pandering to the far left. I don't want to discriminate against anybody, but I don't think biological boys should be playing in girls' sports." Seth Moulton of Massachusetts bleated, "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete, but as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." To Joe and Mika, Suozzi, and Moulton, fuck you, and fuck you. Look, you can stand up for the working class without betraying the most vulnerable among us. Watch. I believe in freedom. I don't think the government should dictate what medical treatment is appropriate for an individual. That is a private matter between a person, their family, and their healthcare provider. The real question is, why do Republicans want to direct your anger at such an incredibly small and powerless minority, less than 1% of the population, when it is a different 1% of the population, their donors, that are hoarding the country's wealth and actively making your lives more difficult? See? It's not so hard. Assholes. Some are giving up on elected politics and the Democratic Party entirely. With top Democrats embracing Goldman Sachs economics, the Chinese hawkish militarism, and Israeli genocidal impunity, many progressives feel like they don't have a home. They'll continue their activism and organizing outside of the party system. To those people, and other disillusioned Democrats on the left of the party, I offer you this. The party is an empty shell. It is morally ambiguous. It is a superstructure that is no better or worse than the people that make it up. A hulking, rusty battleship locked in an eternal struggle with the other hulking, rusty battleship in our two-party system. Current leadership at the DNC and in the Indiana Democratic Party has let us and the nation down. They can and should be removed and replaced with real progressives. But that doesn't happen on its own. It will take a vanguard of like-minded people like us to overtake the controls. I spoke with Monroe County Democratic Party Chair David Henry in February of this year. We talked about his day job as a Homeland Security instructor at the IU O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and his campaign for a seat on the county council, but spent most of our time talking about the inner workings of the Democratic Party. How is it set up? And how could a new generation of economic populist progressives commandeer this vessel and steer it on a new course. The interview has been remastered and with improved sound quality, and now there's video too. But before we jump to it, please consider supporting Who's Left with a paid subscription. I currently work as an independent craftsman to pay the bills and work on this project whenever I can. There are so many more things I want to do here at Who's Left. More campaign finance research, more live hangouts, a daily episode if we can get there. But I need your help to build this thing. So if you can, visit scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help me push our state in a better direction. And maybe if we reach critical mass, I can put down my tool belt and devote my full time to you, to this project, and to Indiana's future. So if you have the means, pause right now, go to scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. And while the best way to help this project is financially, if that doesn't work for your budget at this time, you can still help. Subscribe at the free level over on Substack. Set your favorite podcast player to auto-download new episodes of the show. Rate and review the show on whatever platform you use. This trains the algorithm to help new people find us. Follow me on social media on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left. That's HOOS Left. And on Instagram, Threads, and Twitter for now. I'm at ScottRog78, that's SCOTTROG78, and on Mastodon at ScottRog78 at Hoosier.social. Please subscribe on whichever platforms you use, and send me a DM to discuss ideas for the project. But most importantly, spread the word. Forward the articles to friends, family, and colleagues. Don't just like, but share on social media. Invite others to our little corner of the Indiana left. And while I might be the guy with the microphone, I try to take this thing where your input leads me. So please, be generous with feedback. Good, bad, or indifferent, I value it all. Things are going to be incredibly difficult over the next couple years, and it will be imperative to find community. To those who have joined this community already, thank you. And thanks for listening. Now here's an encore presentation of my incredibly prescient interview with David Henry.
David Henry, thank you for joining the Who's Left podcast. Appreciate it.
Scott, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So, let's begin by introducing you to the listeners here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, again, my name is David Henry. I am a resident of Bloomington and Monroe County here in Indiana. I had moved here 22 years ago, like a lot of folks do, to study at Indiana University. And when I got here for my master's degree, I found a great place to live. I grew up in the Rust Belt in Northern Ohio and was born in Pittsburgh in the Appalachia area. And I guess I'd slowly been working my way across the Midwest and found a place that in my 20s really seemed to be a good fit. Seemed to be a home for me. And so that's how I got here. And I've really called Bloomington home off and on for the past 22 years between jobs working in government and government contracting and teaching at the university. That's how I got here. That's how I got here to this podcast today, Scott.
Very good. So you are, so the day job currently is you are a Homeland Security instructor at the IU O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs.
Yeah, public and environmental affairs. Yeah, so I've worked both in government contracting for about 20 years and out of government. I've worked in county government. I've worked for the District of Columbia government. And I've done government consulting primarily in Homeland Security, emergency management activities around the country, really, for the past decade or so here from Bloomington. I do teach the 2 courses on those topics at IU and try to really share with students that are coming up in a world that's increasingly interested in everything from disasters caused by climate change to white nationalist extremism and terrorism, how to function in governments in our really trying times. And so I've had some great students who have gone on to great careers in those spaces, and at least have been aware of how to approach security from an ethical standpoint. In fact, our program at SPIA is the only program I'm aware of in the country that requires the study of ethics as part of studying homeland security to make sure we don't end up in a catastrophic space like we've seen in previous administrations when it comes to security.
Yeah, that's something I want to ask you about. Because when I think homeland security, I think, I just immediately go back to the George W. Bush administration in my mind. Right. The top of everybody's minds. And
yeah.
It's at least very much within the Republican brand, right? Whether or not it actually reflects truth. That's like their brand. So, including all of the ethical hazards that go with it. So, tell me, what does ethical homeland security look like?
Well, I think it starts with an understanding of there is always going to be a friction or balance between a sense of security and addressing fear with our freedoms. And so for every motion we make that creates what would be a perception of security in our culture, we are probably giving up some freedom along the way to achieve that too. And so one way to think about when we make efforts to think about how we secure for example, a sporting event like the big game last weekend, or how we secure something after an active shooter or active aggressor incident to make sure the school has been either locked down or the people have been triaged away from the disaster. All those things are questions of how much freedom we're willing to give up to have those senses of security. And what we've seen in 4 administrations, you mentioned the Bush administration being the start of it, we've had 4 administrations now that have given us Democratic and Republican versions of what that security story looks like. And one of the greatest challenges in this space is that until Congress really goes back and revisits some of that 2002, 2003 legislation, you're at the whim of executive orders on how to achieve the security. It's how you can have, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all look at the same piece of paper and come to different conclusions about the border, different conclusions about immigration, different conclusions about domestic terrorism and who is a terrorist and who isn't a terrorist.
Well, so I wanted to, I guess we could have a whole hour just on homeland security. I'm not sure go in super deep detail, but I want to wind things back and talk about your involvement in local Democratic Party politics.
Sure.
So give us like the short journey of like how you became shape.
Yeah. So I would say, after doing almost 20 years of civil service in government, working in county governments, working with state governments, working in government contracting, 2016 was a watershed moment for me. We all woke up in November 2016 in a very different reality. And I think, many of us thought we would see. I think, the polling suggested we were looking at another Clinton type presidency with Hillary Clinton potentially winning that race. And what we woke up to was a very different looking America. And I guess at that point, I was so shocked with the turnout and so shocked at the reaction to a country that was willing to install someone like Donald Trump into the presidency office, and an institution I've studied as long as I can remember, Scott. I was one of those government kids that studied this forever. To wake up to that kind of world and having worked so closely with governments around the country for so long, I felt like it was time to get off the bench and do more political work. I've always had an interest in it. I have 2 degrees in it from 2 universities in terms of political science, and it felt like I needed to finally start contributing to this political dialogue. So for me, one of the frustration points was, okay, well, I'm ready to go, and I want to join the local party, and I want to get involved. And I found the inaccessibility to getting involved in a local party to be a little frustrating. I don't think it was anything particular in Monroe County or Indiana. I think it was sort of an experience where if you're not asking the right questions, if you don't know how to volunteer, if you're not following maybe a perception of what or how someone gets involved in politics, you're not shaking the right hands or knowing the right people, it feels a little standoffish. So I think a lot of people in 2016, including myself, started to seek out other opportunities to be involved in the dialogue. So here in Monroe County, here in Southern Indiana, there was a group of people that gathered to form a chapter of the group called Indivisible. That was a proactive activist group that formed in 2016 as sort of a progressive version of what the Tea Party was doing to elected officials to go to public.
A lot of the Sanders campaign, yeah.
It did in a lot of ways, yeah. And so the playbook that was left behind by the Indivisible founders was to, you go to every town hall your member of Congress holds, you bird dog them questions, you call their offices, flood the phones and emails with things. It was basically using the Tea Party playbook against this new Republican regime, and I met a lot of wonderful people. By 2018, we had become pretty adept here in Monroe County about finding, whenever our then Congressman Trey Hollingsworth was making appearances, he sort of had a patrician mentality where he only went to safe spaces for him, the corporate interest or, meetings with private people and law firms. He would never do a public event. But by 20,
he's not even from here.
He wasn't from here. A guy that moved here from Tennessee and basically bought a seat in Congress for about $10 million of his dad's PAC money and occupied Indiana for some time. So it was not a great time to be a Democrat in Southern Indiana with Trey Hollingsworth around. And so by 2018, we had two great candidates that were in the primary, Dan Cannon and Liz Watson. And there was some energy into that primary. We got within 13 points of beating Trey Hollingsworth in that general election with Liz Watson. And that was the high watermark for Democrats. And at that point, I thought, well, gosh, all that energy, all that backlash from 2016. And we were still 13 points off of knocking out a guy who live here that no one even knew, kind of put me in a different direction. So that was my early days getting involved, was primarily, like a lot of folks, activism that gets you into the conversation.
Now you're in the conversation, you're active in the party. How do we get from there to a couple years later where you're leading the party? Now you're the party chair.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, and I can't speak for all counties in Indiana, but Monroe County is a unique space. We're one of three counties that traditionally votes very Democratic in the state of Indiana, 3 out of 92, the others being Marion and Lake County. And in some ways, Monroe County has its own kind of ecosystem about politics. It's the influence of the university. It's the influence of generational Democratic activism that goes back the whole way to RFK in 1968 and 72. You've got legacy upon legacy of Democratic stewardship in our community. And I think in some ways rested on those laurels a little bit. In other ways, the pandemic started to show where the real gaps were, how the party stayed together. So, if a political party is all about putting people in rooms, getting out the vote, putting people in the square to protest, and you're all locked in your houses for 2 years, you start to see this fraying that occurs in the party. And I think at that point, I had noticed being locked up in my house and other people being locked up in their houses, something you're losing any sense of momentum or any sense of party. For me, I had this epiphany moment where I had asked very simply for a campaign sign to be dropped off at my house, as parties do. And our county party chair was the one dropping the sign off at my house. And her name's Jen Crossley. I know Jen well. I was talking to Jen through the masks at my front door saying, why on earth are you the one doing all this work? Why is the chair of the party, the mighty Monroe County Democratic Party, the one doing we're the volunteers helping you do the work? And I realized at that point, that's where we were, that, no one was doing the work at this point. We had an incredible drop off in active party work. So by 2021, the party goes through reorganization. Every 4 years, the party revotes for its leadership. And I said at that point, I'm running for vice chair. I'm getting involved. I am here. I've done some work in activism. I know people. I'm running for vice chair. I'm going to help out Jen. We're going to have a team again. So I got on the board as vice chair of the party. And 2021, we started to get the party back to work after the pandemic period. And by the end of 2021, I found out the thing that happens is when you've worn out a party chair like that for a few years, when someone's the one doing all the work, they want to resign. So Jen had an opportunity to move up to our county council, and I ran for her job. And so I found myself from 2016, all of a sudden in 2021, being the guy on the outside to running the organization, in a very short order. And that is really a nutshell version of how I got into Scott.
Okay, so now you're masterful coup to take over the party from the inside has succeeded, right?
Yeah. Folks, yeah, it's an open playbook. But as I've often told our young college Democrats and people trying to get involved in the party, maybe in fact to try to correct the way I try to get involved is that I just say, look, getting involved is saying I'm involved, right? And it's literally showing up and being there, and it's not waiting for the invitation or the secret handshake. Like, you really just have to step onto the field and say, I'm here. You got to deal with me, and you get involved. That's really how it works.
Before we get to our main topic for today's conversation, I've got to ask, you are a candidate for Monroe County Council at large, contested primary. There are 4 candidates for 3 seats. Does that pose a conflict of interest with your duties as party chair?
Yeah, I think that it is easy to create a conspiracy in the absence of information. And I want to be very careful of that, because in saying that, I'm not suggesting there's conspiracy theory around some of this stuff, but I think, if we take a giant step back for a minute, think about the state of affairs in Indiana when it comes to finding candidates to run for office. Even a county as blue as Monroe County have a diversity of ideas. And to get to the basics of your question, I don't believe there is a conflict of interest. There's no lawful conflict of interest. There's no party rule conflict of interest. In fact, many counties in Indiana have party chairs that are also elected leaders. In our party, very specifically in Marion County, Mila Eldridge is the auditor of Marion County. She is the chair of Marion County Democrats, and she is the vice chair of the whole state party. And so this is a practice that has happened and does happen, where sometimes the party chair puts their name out there. Now, how you deal with that, I think, and how you approach making sure that even if the chair is running, that a candidate has space to run is where I believe a good chair would say, let's welcome the ideas, let's have the debate, let's have the constructive disagreement, let voters decide. Now, that is not always the case. There are clearly other places in Indiana, around the country, where you have sort of a boss politics system where the chair decides who's running and who's not, and maybe discourages people to run. But so long as I've been involved with this, I've made it abundantly clear, we have contested primaries in Monroe County. We don't slate. We're going to have that debate in our party. And I think in a lot of ways we come out better in May when the primary is over, to see, where our voters want to take us. There are sometimes hurt feelings, there are sometimes sore spots, but I think that the perceptions of conflict of interest to sometimes grow in people's minds, when the fact is we need the debate, the spirit of ideas. To go the other way and kind of thwart people running would be just not our values. And so that's my view on that.
Okay, well, then let me ask you this. You're an instructor at the university, you got your job as the party chair, you're a candidate for office. I assume you're not a cyborg and you have to sleep occasionally. Are you wearing too many hats?
There's an old quote by, is there too many hats? Yeah, I think there's an old quote by a Republican about Calvin Coolidge, who once was asked something very similar, and Mr. Coolidge, what are your hobbies? And the answer was, my hobby's running for office. And so I think in a lot of ways, where some people have maybe outside pursuits or hobbies, for me, this has become a bit of an avocation. Being able to lead a political party, to be able to, be engaged in the conversation, to be able to have some ability to help make my community better. And I appreciate sometimes where, some people may look at, how many hats one wears. My answer to that is, busy people are busy sometimes. And there's a lot of doers in our community that wear multiple hats. Now, some of my favorite Bloomingtonians are people that own a barbershop, do comedy routines on Wednesday nights, and teach Taekwondo on the weekends. And that's a real person. And so I think Bloomingtonians generally wear a lot of hats, Scott.
So, David, I was going to ask you what exactly the role of the party chair entails, vis-a-vis, county Democrats, and then your relationship, going the other direction,
sure.
District, state, national.
So a county party is one of and the numbers are actually amazing, Scott. There are 3,143 counties in this country, and every county has a Democratic Party committee. And so there are, at that level, we've broken down the Democratic Party to the county level. There's over 3,000 people like me that are chair of a party that is composed of a bunch of precincts. And the job of that person at the county level is to coordinate the activity at the precinct level of getting out the vote, registering voters, recruiting candidates, and being that booster for the Democratic Party community. On the other side of the aisle, the Republicans have an identical structure, same precinct structure, same chair structure, where I have a counterpart on the other side that is also trying to get out the vote, register voters, recruit candidates to run for office and fill those seats. And so at a very tactical level, the county party chair in that entire hierarchy is looking at how to fill offices at the county level, its cities in that community, the townships in that community, and also its own committee of Democrats that run for political party office at the precinct level. Interestingly enough, Indiana per capita has more elected officials than most other states. I think only Illinois and New Hampshire really outrank Indiana. The number of things you can run for. And when you think about a county like Monroe County, we had an election in 2022 where we elected something like 11 township boards and township trustees, which gives us like over 40 individuals at the township level. Your city council with 9 people, a mayor, a clerk. We've added up to 11, and so on and so on and so on. So we have dozens and dozens of officials in our community that are looking at how to get ballot access, how to navigate the process to run, how to make sure they are filing their forms correctly in the event that there's some issue, to help them with that. And so the county chair's job is to help it really administer the party's team to get on the field and win.
Okay, very good. So then I assume, so you've got a counterpart in every other county around here. Sure. And so I assume there's some sort of state gathering or caucus amongst the county chairs to make some sort of decisions.
Yeah, it may be.
How does that work?
Good question. It may be fruitful to step back, given this statewide podcast, and I'm sure there's other Hoosiers listening thinking, well, how does it work in my county? I've never heard of this level of organization with over 50 Democrats winning seats. It may be worth just taking a second to talk about what a party is and how it's structured. And so in the United States, we have a system that starts at the precinct level. In a given county, you may have, in our case, 82 precincts in our county. Every county in America, you take those 3,000 counties and you break them into these tiny fractions of geopolitical pieces. And you're talking about like 175,000 precincts in the United States. So that breakdown of our country into these walkable neighborhoods of about 600 to 1,000 voters with a precinct captain is the tip of the spear of the entire Democratic Party, from the DNC the whole way down into your neighborhood. And so the whole structure, the whole concept of a political party on both sides of the aisle is to take a variety of precincts with outreach to those 600 to 1,000 voters, with those precinct captains electing a county chair, a county vice chair, a county secretary, and a county treasurer to manage the county party. From there, the counties in a congressional district elect a district level version of that. So we have 9 congressional districts in Indiana, and each of those congressional districts, with their chair and vice chair of those counties, elect a district committee. So we have a district chair, a district vice chair, a district secretary, district treasurer. And so those district officers, chairs and vice chairs, in the 9 congressional districts, and some representatives of affiliated caucuses, Labor, the African American Democrat Caucus in Indianapolis, the IDAC, the Stonewall Democrats, among others, have people that serve in the state central committee. And so it's the congressional district committee members plus the caucuses that have seats at that table that elect your state party chair, your state party vice chair, your state party secretary, your state party treasurer. And the state chair and state treasurer are 1 or 2 of 55 when you include the territories versions of those state organizations that make up the DNC, who then elect the DNC chair. And so the whole thing, comes up from the precincts, through the counties, through the congressional districts, through the states, to elect that Democratic National Committee that has a DNC chairperson and is the party. And so what you really end up with is something like 350,000 people that have a role as an elected or appointed leader in this Democratic Central Committees from Monroe County to Indianapolis to Washington, D.C. And I think that when you think about it like that, and you think about your space in that space, how the organization functions, like how do you control for 350,000 people, carrying the message, getting voters registered, that it gives you a sense of the scope and scale of what both parties are really doing in the country and how that works.
So that I want to talk about, your role on the county level.
Sure.
Kind of, we mentioned kind of taking our little blue island for granted, right? We have our little area where, oh boy, we've got, 40, 50 something Democrats in elected office and, actually doing good things and having well-run, generally responsive, good government. I have beefs. Everybody has some, right? Sure. Everybody's allowed to. That's fine. But generally, Monroe County is well run, So it sounds like we can't really translate that, to our district, because you're just, say, like 2 out of 18 people or whatever in in the district for voting. Do you run into problems with the other the other county parties?
I think that's a good question. I think it comes back to maybe some fundamental flaws in what I just described to you. So in a lot of ways, we're still living in a precinct model that its bones, its structure goes back 198 years. And I'm not kidding. The Democratic Party just celebrated its 198th birthday on January 8th. And it is the longest continuous serving party in the world. That's one of those historical nuances. But, as we get approached president today, I think it's kind of funny to think about we're not presidents. And we are living in Mark Van Buren's world. This was Van Buren's vision of how to get Andrew Jackson elected, to break the country down into these little isolated precinct type structures.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, when you think about what happens when, since the 1970s in our country, we've had a sorting in our counties where people don't want to live in spaces that they don't feel comfortable. So they move to a blue space or a red space. That sorting in our counties has created a situation like in the 9th District where you have one really blue county, Monroe County, kind of some purplish counties with Clark County and Floyd County down south, and then sometimes, depending on turnout in Dearborn County, they might see some bluish places. It means that in a very practical sense for your listeners, that Monroe County is sort of the Manhattan surrounded by Wyoming, southern Indiana, where if you think about the way the U.S. Senate has 2 votes per state, so too the county. So I have 2 votes where nearly a third of all Democratic votes come through Monroe County in the 9th District, but I have 2 votes in that committee. And I have to negotiate with counties that may have some different ideas about democratic politics that can outvote me in a more moderate sort of way. And it does create some conflict. I think there's inherent conflict built into that structure. And I bring up Martin Van Buren because it's his fault. It goes all the way back to this whole idea of voting by geography instead of perhaps population. And what people get mad about in the U.S. Senate, you could easily get mad about if you think about the way district structures work. It's a totally legitimate constructive criticism.
Well, you stole my my words about how it replicates the U.S. Senate. No, it does. It perpetuates all of the undemocratic or anti-small d democratic features, and that are inherent in our system, and it keeps baking them in. And it feels like that may be hard to overcome, perhaps. So I'm just a lowly precinct committee person. I want to say I want to, get together my band of friends and take over the local party.
Yeah.
What do you really need to do?
What do you really need to do? So for your listeners that are contemplating things, how do you turn the head of the machine? And how do you get involved? I think it goes back to something I said in the interview. First of all, in this space, and I've learned over the years that you need to assert. You start going to meetings. You start showing up to events. You start being in the community. You don't wait for the handshake or the phone call or the text that says, "Scott, it's time for you to join." You basically have to step onto the field and start showing up where your party is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that can be done in different ways. I mean, this is the Midwest. I think you break bread with people and you have conversations. I don't think a storming the castle approach would necessarily work. But I do think there's interesting ideas here. Getting involved at the precinct level in a system that hasn't really flexed that precinct muscle in a long time at that party discipline. You looking at your slice of the county as a place where you could build a precinct committee, a monthly meeting among neighbors, a conversation among voters to get your neighborhood from going from a 20% voter turnout to an 80 or 90% voter turnout. Is the beginning of that conversation. You duplicate that through a county committee where you need, between your chairs and vice chairs, depending how many precinct captains and vice captains you have in a county. If you have the majority, in our case, in Monroe County, of 164 of those, you can start to elect leadership that maybe reflects a different vision of what you would like your party to be. I do think that while in Monroe County we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to Democratic views and viewpoint, I've taken a different leadership role in terms of how I think about progressive politics and how we move the entire plot diagram of our party in a direction. We can talk about that in a minute. But if you're in a rural county, you're listening to thinking, "Oh gosh, there's no hope." It's like, no, there actually is hope. It starts with for people in Indiana, looking ahead to the midterm primary of May of 2026, when you can go to your election board office, register to run as a precinct committee person in your county, and then go knock doors in your neighborhood, tell registered Democrats why you're running to be this lowly slice of a position in a party leadership, with the hope to get people inspired to a different kind of politics in Indiana. It's really starting that simple. You got to convince 600 voters in a neighborhood that you're the person. And you're going to speak on those values.
Are there a lot of, and I'm sure you can speak to Monroe County and your little fiefdom here. Are there a fair amount of vacancies for precinct committee persons
Statewide? Or here in Monroe County?
Here and statewide.
Well, here in Monroe County, every chair has worked hard to fill those seats. I'm very proud of the fact that we elected the majority of our committee through the ballot box, that it wasn't a chair backfilling just to fill in spots. But right now we have 78 of 82 positions filled here, which I think is considerable over the past few years. And so I think that comes by virtue of finding good diversity of voices to bring into the party, and then hopefully they'll run for those seats and have them themselves. But I guess we should back up to say that, well, what happens if you miss that window to run? Well, if there are vacancies in your committee right now, if no one is your precinct committee person in your county, find that out. You should go talk to your local chair and ask to be appointed. You don't necessarily even need to be appointed in your neighborhood, though it's preferable for certain reasons, especially when in Indiana we have a process by which we fill public offices by vote of this committee, to try to live where you're proximate to where that vacancy occurs. You should talk to that. And I will say, and this is probably where I start getting in trouble with my peers. Monroe County has always shared our precinct list, but as a private organization, which a political party is, I think we sometimes forget that. Dealing with two private organizations, the Republican and Democratic duopoly, that some chairs do not share those lists. You'd have to really go wrestle those out of your board of elections where people ran, or you maybe have to call the state party to say, I want to know who my committee is in County X. And those are some legacy questions about how the party's evolved over the years, from a very private organization where behind smoke-filled doors you selected who's going to be your slate to a more contemporary version of the party that demands that the transparency that we enjoy in our county. So, but if you're listening to this and you're thinking, gosh, how do I get involved? How do I be that person? Yeah, it starts with really getting to know your county chair and figuring out how you can get appointed to or run for those spaces in your community.
And in a place that isn't, Monroe or Lake or Marion County, there very likely are vacancies available to be filled, and it probably desperately need to fill.
And we have, again, if Monroe County has a cold, the rest of the state may have like political COVID on some of these issues. So when we have a downturn turnout in the county, it is exponentially worse in other counties. There are counties in the state, unfortunately, that have a hard time even having a chair, vice chair, or secretary and treasurer of their party, let alone a recent committee person. And so the rebuilding of the Democratic Party from 22 years ago when I moved here, where we had the governor's mansion, the Speaker of the House in Indiana's General Assembly, the senator, half of the slate in the U.S. House of Representatives, to where we are now, is not insignificant. There are communities that are so denuded that there may be a vacancy even in your party chairmanship of the county to go inquire about, and you should with the state party to see if you can get more.
And I know, boy, the national party makes it hard sometimes to want to jump in and be a cheerleader. And I don't know, how much of this you can speak of, but I always do want to encourage leftists and socialists and progressives to get involved in the Democratic Party, because, like it or not, that's the way our system is set up. It is the nature of all or nothing voting. It's not like the two parties are mandated in the Constitution, but just the way our system is set up, it will always devolve into a two-party system. And third parties, minor parties, will always hurt the party they're closest to in a general election.
I think that you're absolutely right on that. The duopoly is baked into state law here in Indiana. We have cases where an independent may seek to run for office, and their ability to get on the ballot compared to a Democrat or Republican is exponentially harder. You see situations where they will have to collect signatures to run for like a county council, and the parties only need to say, "Here's my slate of names." You just sign up and run. So the duopoly is it's baked into the law, and that is definitely for those that have the aspirations of third parties and trying to be more like a parliamentary model like a Germany or a United Kingdom. Good luck. So we have to accept, I think, in a lot of ways, the playing field as it is. It's interesting. This is a left and progressive podcast, and so some people sometimes say, "Gosh, this is the bureaucracy. This is the establishment on the call here." And yet, Monroe County is a little different with that. My inspiration comes from people like Gore Vidal, who would openly criticize the system and say it's just two factions of the same party, or that we're really picking between brown sugar water when it comes to the team red or team blue. But I think to get to your question about, well, how, if this is who we are, we got to pick team blue over team red. If we have to pick that sugar water over the other sugar water, what does that really mean for your involvement? And I think it comes down to a few different things for me. Firstly, the reason why Monroe County is the way it is that this community, through its university culture and through people that are attracted to live around places like that, have typically voted left of center in primaries when given a choice. This is a county that, when given the choice between a Jerry Brown and a Bill Clinton, went with a Jerry Brown, went with a Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton, it went with a Barack Obama over Hillary Clinton. What happens when that doesn't happen, right? When that candidate doesn't come through, is voters stay home. And so we end up in a situation where our progressive left sometimes say, "I don't see me here." We tried. We got involved, we did all that work, just couldn't overcome the more centrist impulse of the Indiana Democratic Party, which is, kind of back to your comment about, being surrounded by more purple places for me, right? So how does that progressive get there? How does somebody say, how do I bring a Democratic socialist vision or progressive vision to the party. And it really is, I think, accepting the conditions of the battlefield that you're entering, instead of trying to throw your hands up and say, well, I'm just going to create my own sandbox. So, and what I mean by that, right, is that if you can figure out how a precinct structure works, and that really it's the accumulation of very small pieces that start to make up a whole. I've always felt that, whoever figures this piece of the puzzle out in Indiana politics, whoever really figures out that you need a grassroots, door by door, inspirational effort, will eventually turn the head of the giant, which is the party. And I think that's really the most important message for people trying to get involved in that space, is figuring out the rules of engagement and then getting into the space to see if you can change that. I left something out. You had said, well, the state or national party kind of makes it hard. And I would agree with that, Scott. I grew up in Northern Ohio in the 1990s. It was the Clinton, .com, amazing, the amazing infrastructure, the end of history. We won the Cold War. The peace dividend is here. The economy's booming.
Right.
At the same time, my Ford plant moves out of the country. My friends that had dads in the UAW were chasing work all over. I didn't experience the same economic enjoyment that perhaps our East Coast and West Coast brothers and sisters did. And I think that is where we are right now. Like, it is really hard locally to say, well, the economy is doing so well, they say out east. And yet, we see the inflationary effects in Indiana. We see the disparity in income and the cost of living that just seems to be really distorted. And yeah, it's really hard to carry a national message of, the president's doing a great job, that the governor is a Republican here, they're not doing a great job. And then locally, we got this Democratic Party that's doing a great job. But I don't really feel like I've got a lot on my plate if I'm already under a certain dollar amount a year in this community. That is why I think messaging at a local level is very hard, but it comes back to putting people at a door and saying, how is it working for you? And then maybe we get a democratic version of our conversation here county by county. It's going to be different for each county, state, sure.
Is the Indiana State Democratic Party doing it right? I feel like, now this is me, this is the leftist speaking, like we've been running after this imaginary middle that doesn't exist for a long time. In Indiana, since especially 2010, the big red takeover, where they, baked their gains into the district maps. The Democrats have been running centrists for governor, for senator, the big state level offices, even the offices for Congress. And we keep getting our asses kicked. Is it time for a different message?
Yeah. So let me give you, I think, where the tensions are. I think maybe places like Monroe County versus places that maybe have a different view. I think there are two battlefronts in this debate in the party right now. I think this is a fair thing to say for everyone listening statewide here. I think there's a school of thought that I belong to, and I know some others do, that when you go back to the 2008 election, look at the map of Indiana, and you realize that Barack Obama won this state. First time a Democrat won since LBJ. The question is, well, how did that happen? And the answer to that is there were 15 counties that carried the state for Barack Obama, 15 out of 92, which is the lesson should be that if we were thinking strategically about, well, how do you get people elected statewide in Indiana? Do you advance a 92 county strategy where we have to build up everything everywhere and build a bench everywhere and get Democrats everywhere? Or if you have scarce resources, do you try to beg and steal and plead with the Obama era volunteers to say, how do we capture that lightning in a bottle again? How much of it was the charisma of the candidate and just Barack Obama being sui generis? I mean, so just a singularity. How much is it that we look at the counties that won in the state in 2008? They were all college counties, Tippecanoe, Delaware, the Chicago region, St. Joe's. You look at these places and say, well, I mean, they all have college communities. Clearly, there's some energy there. 15 counties wins Indiana, period. We know, I mean, that is the map. But it goes back to our geography problem, right? If you say that you're in a district or statewide leadership, you're basically excluding all those other counties and saying, well, good luck to you, but we're focused on this 15 county solution to run the table. And the problem is those 15 counties are split into all the congressional districts. So you have the high-powered blue counties. In the hierarchy, they're split into the districts that have to deal with district level voting, state level voting. So the structure prevents us from, I think, a lateral communication to say, how do you tether these 15 counties that really carry the state? That to me is the debate. It is the thing that, I can see a path forward with it. I know other counties that are in those 15. We've had these discussions that potentially we can carry forward with, but it's sort of, but what we've done is a kind of different approach since 2008 and expect a different result every cycle. So I guess if I were state chair for a day, I'd be thinking about how do you capture that 2008 magic, because we're not that far removed from those voters. Now, some of them clearly have passed on, demographically speaking, right? But it's not like we're not talking about the FDR generation. We're talking about in our lifetime, Scott, we've seen the state go blue at a statewide. So that to me is the big schism. When do we have the real conversation that when there's nothing that wins like winning, that if we can capture statewide wins through a strategy like that, it will eventually provide the coattails down into counties that maybe get their first win on commissioner, first win on county council, first win on a township board, and start to build a bench. The second thing I'd say in a hurry is, and how that maybe there are some challenges, is that we're facing a situation in the state where we have four congressional seats that are now open races because Republicans are running, right? And the bench to fill those, like when you look at the people that filed in like the 8th district, you have a bench a mile long of Republicans ready to run for the 8th district seat. And there was some real work to try to find some candidates for the Democratic side. And those are including cities like, Terre Haute and Evansville, where you would think there might be a former mayor or somebody sitting around that might want to run for Congress. But we just can't get there. And so the bench building activity, where we are so denuded on the Democratic side on our bench to find that next statewide candidate. The Republicans, in theory, have the next 6 governors lined up. And I couldn't tell you the next 6 Democrats that are going to be running for governor, but I definitely could make guesses as to who the rest of our lifetime, the likely governors of Indiana are going to be. That should get people motivated to get a little more involved.
It seems backward, right? Like, this is the Democratic Party. We're the party of the people. Why are we having a bench problem? Like, the Republicans should have, they shouldn't have depth to choose from, and they don't. I mean, they groom certain people, put them in spots, and they're very good at it. But shouldn't we have options?
I think
where are people?
I think when you look at a gerrymandered map and say, I'm looking at a situation where I in order for me to get to 50%, I got to climb out of a 22-point hole just to get to half of the votes in that community. I think that becomes the challenge, where serious people say, if I'm going to give a year of my life to run for Congress, run for Senate, run for something, and I know the closest I'm going to get is like a failing grade on an exam, like 30%, right? That it is daunting, right? I mean, I think about running the race I'm running here, and even though great potential in a Democratic primary in a Democratic county to be seated, it's still work. But to work at a level where the mountain is that high, you need some very brave people, or some very confident people, or some people that know they're signing up for defeat, but they're gonna be the next person to take a chip out of Mount Republican and try to get over this thing. So it's almost accepting that you're going to have several cycles of just accepted loss to keep chipping away. And again, it comes the whole way back down to this conversation. If we do not have a functioning precinct committee that understands that when you are seated in a county party and you have that little slice of a map, if you can't account for your neighborhood if you can't even make the dent in the neighborhood to say, I knocked every door, I tried to get my neighbors registered to vote, I literally drove them to vote that day. We're in some challenges. I mean, so I do think it does fall back on the party to say, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail, as Coach Wood taught us, right? If you can't get the conditions where you have a higher voter turnout because you haven't done the work of actually registering voters and trying to talk to your neighbors, you just can't expect that people are all of a sudden going to show up and vote unless you wait for another Barack Obama, and that may take a while. So I think that's really important to point out.
Yeah. Well, I think you've done a really good job, explaining like the how it works. Like I was saying, it's not, especially for people to the left of me. I'm pretty far left, but I know there's people who are really, really, really frustrated with our system as it exists, because it's like a couple of 200-year-old like jalopies playing demolition derby with each other, or it's like steering an aircraft carrier, right? These things don't turn around quickly. And I mean, sure, you can try and take over the system in like a better canoe, but I don't know. I think it's probably going to be easier to take over that 200-year-old hulking battleship.
All up and starting over. I think either way, it's sort of like I hate to be the guy that serves the bowl of vegetables no one wants to eat at Thanksgiving, but it kind of comes off this way to say either path, either doing the work of within a party structure that has just been so neglected and unmaintained, and doing the work of creating a party that does the work of grassroots door knocking and voter registration is still the same level of work, right? It's either go form another party that literally builds up from the base and gets that 20%, and attempts to run people to get them on the ballot, like libertarians usually try to do, or something like that. Or you try to take the car and take it to the shop and fix it up and actually get it working again. Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of work. I mean, when I was involved in an activist group that was engaged in progressive politics like Indivisible, the point of Indivisible was to advocate for Medicare for all and student loan debt relief and all the things that I think 3 generations of Americans under the age of 45 are clamoring for. There's an urgency. And that urgency, it's like a firework. It burns fast. You get that first campaign or that first protest under your belt, and then you lose, and all of a sudden it's like, well, it's all for naught. The hardest challenge, I believe, and I don't mean to be lecturing progressives and left of center folks. I think of myself as like pragmatically progressive when I speak this way, is that you have to accept that this change requires retail. It requires convincing people that do not want to be convinced that there's a solution that's different. And it is this really hard work of persuading people outside of our noise machines to register to vote and vote. And I do think, to maybe put a fine point on it, we are probably in another cycle putting that to the test. We have some opportunities here in our election cycle locally where we have some progressive voiced people that are really good at explaining progressive values to more moderate voters. And we have some moderate candidates that are really good at explaining moderate values to moderate voters. And we're going to see what shows up. And we may be in for another lesson or round of this until we finally take the lesson. And that,
yeah, you know what? The difficult work of organizing, of party building, of coalition building, it might not be sexy. And I really, really get the urge to want to blow everything up. But because it's a huge remodeling job, right? And I'm a guy that does this for a living, or you know, at least I was there for a while. Like, it's always easier to start with a clean slate and build with all new material. But like, I don't think our side's prepared for that. Like, the fascists have been preparing for the system to be blown up. They're ready. They have the guns. I don't, you know, when the system blows up, like left accelerationists, if are we going to come out ahead? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think that urgency is real too. But I think you just hit on it. You know, the project called the Republican Party after the fall of Nixon has been a 45-year march to this spot. It required and so if we're going to be just cold political analysts for a minute, you know, when you look at what came out of the religious right in the late 1970s, the Reagan Revolution, the Gingrich overtaking of Congress, all of that, it's been a very long trajectory with one goal in mind, and it was the Dobbs decision. I mean, so to have on the wall your target and say, I don't care what we do every day, all these distractions, it's all about Roe versus Wade. And to keep and that be a generational mission to teach your kids and grandkids, that's the North Star. That has to change. That level of discipline is just unheard of in Democratic politics. Like, if you had to say today, like, well, you know, our mission, and if it takes my grandkids to get there, is to, you know, to have Medicare for all, you know, or to have a return to reproductive rights in our culture. Like, are we even remotely prepared, you know, to set up the long game? And the answer is, yeah, no. It is the building of, you know, the accepting that you're building the battleship and you're thinking about the 50-year plan. That, I think, if progressives and Democrats get in the mindset that we're now talking about a generational shift and not something that happens in one or two election cycles, like that is a hard retreat. Or like, you'd ask me to the Democrats take a retreat, go to the secret meeting and figure this out. Like, no, this is the serious conversation. But I think to your analogy of restoring the house is intriguing because, again, you know, if this party is almost 200 years old and it started with, you know, a Southern Democrat slave owner and a Northern Democrat, you know, ambivalent businessman, you know, who formed a coalition to elect the first populist president, Andrew Jackson, a party that was a pro-slavery party that became an anti-capitalist party that became FDR's near socialist party, the closest thing we've ever seen to a Labor Party in this country under FDR's presidency, to a 1970s George McGovern party, to a Jimmy Carter party, Bill Clinton party, Barack Obama, that neoliberal version of the party. We have seen the House renovated a few times. And those renovations have come by way of a generation coming up to say, the way Grandpa did it doesn't work anymore. I do think we are on an interesting cusp where if activists are listening to us talk, and they're learning a little bit about, well, gosh, all it takes is getting 80 of us to run for precinct chair to flip, you know, my county. It's a start. It's what happened in Bloomington in 1972 when we had activists that were very democratic, you know, take a community that had 6 Republicans on city council, 8 Republicans, 8-1 majority, to a complete, a 1-8 Republican majority, 8 members, to 8 Democrats, 1 member, to elect a Democratic mayor in 1972 and never look back. We've had Democratic mayors here for over 50 years. Like, we had that local revolution where the party was taken over and run again that way. So there's hope, but we are in a renovation. And the neoliberal movement that dates back to Bill Clinton's Democratic Leadership Council, the politics of 1990s Democrats, is that's part of the jalopy that's showing where.
Yeah.
And there's a generation saying, you know, do we recreate the moderate version and try to win like that again? Or do we try something different, which we know, like in my county, has great appeal when Bernie Sanders can show up to this town 2 or 3 times and put 4,000 people out in the middle of a field and frog marches them to vote that day. There's something going on in my community, right? There may be a different message that people want.
I like that. All right. Well, David Henry. So before we get out of here, where can the people find you?
Sure. Well, officially, in terms of a campaign, I appreciate that space. I'm at votedavidhenry.com here for County Council, Monroe County. And we have an opportunity here to fund our values in the next few years to make sure that we're really putting our money where our mouth is on some of the things we've been talking about. Forward to speaking with people in our community about maybe a different path as we look for housing choices and economic job opportunities for my whole community, not just academics, not just people that retire here, but really that people like me that moved here with just trying to go to school and living in equity housing and trying to make it. So I'm very concerned about the job market. So I hope you find me there at votedavidhenry.com. For our party, if you want to see how the Monroe County Democratic Party does its business, we're at monroedems.org. And if you are someone out there thinking, gosh, how do I get my county to do a little bit like we do here in Monroe, we're obviously up for helping folks think through some ways to do that outreach. We don't have all the answers here, but we definitely have a very talented pool of Democrats in my community that have seen it all, worked on presidential, congressional, senatorial campaigns. And I'm happy to help inspire you all to get more involved and hopefully build your parties all over Indiana.
Very good. David Henry, thank you so much for joining the HoosLeft podcast. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
Once again, that was Monroe County Democratic Party Chair David Henry, and he won that seat on the county council in this year's general election. This, with only minor revision, is what I had to say at the end of the original episode. I come across way too many partisan cheerleaders and not enough Democratic leaders willing to focus a critical eye on those at the top of the party. This is a guy who gets it, a progressive who came into the party from Indivisible, from the Sanders camp, and he understands that this is a very long game. I'm glad we have someone like him here in Monroe County. And we all have to understand that this is a long game. There are no quick fixes. And I reject the premise that we have to blow the whole thing up and start over. I think that leads down the road to an openly Christo-fascist dictatorship. Accelerationism is doom, especially in the face of an unconstrained second Trump presidency. All of us are going to have to pull together. Republicans built the machine that is currently chipping away at our democracy over more than 50 years. In 1971, Lewis Powell, whom Nixon would nominate to the Supreme Court the following year, drew up the blueprint for complete corporate oligarchic control of the country in a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Through a series of think tanks and foundations, and with lots of money from the Koch, Olin, Bradley, DeVos, and Coors families, among others, economic elites shepherded the power of, as David mentioned, white evangelical Christian extremism using race and then abortion as a wedge issue. They understood this may take decades, and the oligarchs finally got what they wanted, legalized political bribery, in 2010's Citizens United case. The religious zealots had to wait a dozen more years for Dobbs. The left better damn well understand this, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The party's foundation is rotten, I get it, but the house has good bones. Let's not waste a ton of time, energy, and money building a new structure from scratch. By the time we have the skeleton built, MAGA extremists may have burned it all down. I know it might not be a popular opinion, but if leftists like us want to remake this country in our image, we restart by remaking the Democratic Party in our image. Do you live in a county with no party chair? How about you? Is there an opening for precinct committee person where you live? Fill it. There isn't? Run next time. Show up. Make calls. Stop waiting for a savior. It's you. You are the savior. Together, we must save ourselves. Look, say you're out on a hike and it starts to rain. Torrential downpour. You and your hiking partner each have a tent. Theirs is a pop-up, sets up in no time, but it's a little leaky and not very big. Yours is nicer, brand new, all the features you wanted, but it takes some time to set up. They're both big enough for 2 people, but just barely. You both cram into the pop-up, right? It might be uncomfortable, you might get a little wet, but you won't get soaked. The sky is looking mighty dark come January. So get in. The only way to weather this storm is together. Thank you for listening. Thanks again to my guest, David Henry. His campaign website is still up at votedavidhenry.com. And the county party is at monroedems.org. Donations are always needed. Finally, if you appreciate what I do here, visit scottaaronrogers.substack.com, where donations, or rather paid subscriptions, are also always needed. That's where you'll find everything I publish, but you can also find me on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at HoosLeft, and on most other social media sites at ScottRog78. My DMs are open for feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns. You can also email me at scottrog78@gmail.com. Forward the show to a friend, and have them forward it to another friend. Let's keep building this project in a more democratic state. Until next time, this has been the Who's Left podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.